And okay, so I am going to use this time at the beginning of our session to explain the task to you and to do some housekeeping rules about how we're going to organize it. If you have questions that you'd like to ask me during this session, please press the raise hand button and I'll invite you to turn on your microphone and camera if you wish to ask the question that way. We will try to avoid using the chat for questions this time, so it's really the reverse of our session on Wednesday where we were primarily typing questions. This time, given the interactive nature of the exercise, if it's accessible to you, I'd like you to ask the question orally, and if that's not accessible, then of course, please feel free to type your question in the chat. So the first thing I want to say before we go any further is that you will be receiving a message that you are being assigned to breakout groups because we are splitting you into teams for this exercise. So please just leave that message on your screen that tells you that you have been assigned to a breakout group, and don't click on it until we tell you that we are about to enter the breakout groups. If you have not received a message to say that you are assigned to a breakout group, don't worry, that just means that you are going to be staying in the main room with me and the other mentors. And the main room where I will be is the one where you will have access to the real-time captioning and to the international sign language interpretation. So those of you who indicated when you registered that you needed captioning or international sign language interpretation for accessibility, we have automatically assigned you to the main room. If you didn't indicate that you need those things on registration for the summer school, but you do in fact need them, then don't worry, you can just let your mentor know when you enter the breakout room if you want to come back to the main room where the captions and international sign language will be available, and we'll facilitate that switch. Okay, so I think those are the two main housekeeping rules I needed to do before I start to explain the task. So let me explain to you what we're doing with this participation exercise and how it's going to work. So first of all, those of you who have attended previous summer schools may remember that when we did the summer school in person, we would normally have a moot court or other participatory exercise to close the summer school on our final day. And so we had to try to figure out how we could transfer a task like that into an online format. And this is what we've come up with. So instead of in the moot court, we would have generally been presenting arguments to a mock UN committee on the rights of persons with disabilities, following the process that is available for those who want to make individual complaints to the committee under the optional protocol. Now, we're not going to do that this time, so we're reversing the roles again, and instead of presenting arguments to a mock UN committee, you are imagining that you are that mock UN committee, and your task is to draft guidance for states on the interpretation of Article 30 on participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure and sport, which of course is the theme and the focus of this year's summer school. So, what does that draft guidance look like? In your briefing document, which has been shared with you and you will have access to again in the breakout sessions, you have been told that we are following the format of a general comment. So for those of you who are new to the work of the UN committee, I'll just briefly explain what a general comment is and the format and structure it takes. A general comment is something that the UN committee developed because they want to give more detailed guidance to states on how exactly they should apply and interpret the norms provided in the UN convention itself. So often states find that they don't fully understand what it is that's required of them in terms of implementing the rights in the UN convention. And the UN committee has noticed this in its dialogues with states, where it issues concluding observations to tell states that have reported to it what needs to change in order to realise the rights of disabled people in that country. So what we're going to do here is imagine that we are the UN committee And we know what the issues are in terms of non-compliance of states with the requirements of Article 30. And we are going to draft some really clear guidance for those states, explaining in much more detail than the text that we already have in the convention, and also in more detail than we have in the concluding observations to date, which are, as you may know, for those of you familiar with the UN Committee's work, those concluding observations are very short. So often it's just a sentence or two for each article in terms of the recommendation to countries. So now we have a much bigger scope in this document, which will be 4,000 words in total, but it means that each of you are allocated a separate section, and your individual sections each team is writing will be 1,000 words each. Okay, so I'll explain in a moment what exactly those sections are, but first let me give you more context and information about what a general comment tries to do and the kind of tone we should be aiming for in what we're writing. So a general comment is trying to encourage states that are doing good practices in this area and discouraging and criticizing states that are doing bad practices in the area, but without singling out and naming and shaming any particular states. So it's supposed to be a general perspective. So it's more detailed guidance than we have anywhere else in the text of the convention or the concluding observations, but it's not calling out states that we believe are engaging in bad practices by name. But we can, of course, identify as a general thing what those bad practices are. So, for example, if we see that states are developing inaccessible playgrounds. Now, this is something that will not happen in just one state. It's a common thing that may be happening in many states. That as a practice is something that can be highlighted. But we don't want to name any particular state and say that they are doing a bad practice. And on the same note, we also don't want to highlight any state that we think is doing a good practice, because even though on paper it may appear to be a good practice, we don't know until we talk to disabled people on the ground what that's actually like in reality. So things that may appear to be a promising practice may not truly be. And once the committee has named a particular practice in a general comment as a good one, then it's very difficult for that practice to be challenged later on, even if it turns out to be one that's actually not as progressive as it first appears. So keep your comments general. Keep your tone relatively formal, imagining that we are the UN committee. Praise the good developments that are occurring without naming states, and criticize the developments that are not what we need, but provide as much detail as we can on how states can make the shift from the inaccessible practices that are currently in place to the progressive, accessible world that we all want to see. Another thing to be aware of when drafting a general comment is that you should provide guidance that draws on the UN Committee's own existing documents. So obviously the text of the convention is an important supporting document, as are the concluding observations on Article 30. You can also look at all of the other general comments that have actually been written by the UN Committee, and there are 7 so far, to get an idea of the kind of tone and structure and things that can be said in a general comment. And hopefully, when you review those, that will start to inspire you. Now, it's important in this that we follow the same structure that a general comment would typically follow. So the first section of every general comment is called the introduction, but it's not a particularly short introduction. So we're kind of considering this to be one of the substantive sections that one team is going to work on. So with the introduction, the committee is setting in context what exactly the reason why they need to draft this general comment and this guidance, what's the background against which this document has been developed. So why is this a big issue for states? Why is this guidance necessary? How does this guidance build on existing human rights norms? So in that respect, throughout the whole general comment, you will be able to refer only to UN documents as references officially in the document. So we can't reference academic research, reports of NGOs, anything like that. We can only reference UN documents, and primarily we should really be referencing the documents created by the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities itself. Although, of course, we can also reference documents created by other UN treaty bodies. So because we're focused on culture for this task, we might want to reference the documents created by the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, for example. So that will be the context setting part, and that is the role of the introduction, to place this document in context, explain why it's needed, and explain how it, I suppose, fits within the committee's work more broadly and the work of other UN treaty bodies. The second section of the document is called the normative content. And so another team is going to be working on normative content. And for that section, the goal is to explain each of the provisions in that article in more detail. So you go section by section through what's stated in Article 30, and you provide context and you explain, especially if things are open to interpretation, could be read one way or the other way. It's up to you in that section to explain this is how that should be interpreted. We all know that these instruments, like the UN Convention, its text is inevitably the product of international compromise. So it will always have vagueness, it will always have things that can be read in different ways. And with something like a general comment, a committee is trying to clear up some of that vagueness and trying to explain a bit more how exactly we should interpret this in practice. But of course, the committee is not empowered to go off and interpret things into the text that were never intended by the drafters. And so in that respect, it might be useful to look back at some of the negotiation archive of the convention. And because this convention was created in the 21st century, we luckily have access online to the negotiation archives. So you can review some of the material from that. And it will also be worth listening again to the recorded panelist session from Monday that you received, where Montien Buntan, who was one of the drafters of Article 30, along with Janet Lord, Delia Ferry, and Amy Farkas, describe what exactly was in the drafters' minds when they created Article 30. What were they responding to? What opportunities did they miss? And what were they thinking about how this could be interpreted? So we're not bound strictly to only things that the drafters considered. We can say now that given how the convention is being applied in practice, it is a living document and it changes. It has to adapt to new circumstances and information. So we can explain that even if the drafters didn't foresee something, this is a reality that we are now living with, and it should be taken into account in how we apply the text of Article 30. So that's the normative content section, which another team will be working on. And then we move to the state obligations part. So the state obligations part of the general comment has its own structure, which again, you can see in examples of in previous general comments created by the committee. And what this section of the document is doing is really giving the most detail possible about the specific actions that states are required to take to implement all of the elements that we've just described in the normative content section. So here we're providing advice and guidance on what kinds of laws, policies and practices need to be abolished and what should be created instead, and how can states do that. So it's providing that sort of detailed understanding of not just what the text means, but how we're going to get there, the practical roadmap for how that can be achieved. So that's the state parties obligation section. And the final section that we've listed is the interrelationship with other articles of the convention. So we know that all human rights are interdependent, indivisible, and interrelated. So Article 30 of the Convention needs to be read in light of many other articles within the Convention. It's the job of the team working on that section to decide which articles precisely they want to focus on as being the most relevant to interpreting Article 30 in practice, because you can't list every single article of the convention. You don't have space within 1,000 words to describe everything. So you should choose only the most relevant ones and explain what they give to the interpretation of Article 30. So do they add something, do they help us to understand specifically how this can be applied in practice in a specific way? And in doing that, you should have, for some articles at least, existing general comments from the UN committee that may have mentioned cultural life, that may have mentioned Article 30. And you can draw on those as source material to explain how these articles interact with each other, how we can interpret them consistently. So sometimes, for example, people would try to argue that there's contradictions between one article of the convention and another. Now, the drafters, and in particular the UN committee, would not see there being a conflict between any of the articles. So in this section, the team responsible will be really trying to draw that out and explain, here's how we can read the text of the convention harmoniously, how we can interpret it in a consistent way, how we can address any perceived tensions between Article 30 and other articles in a way that respects the human rights of all disabled people. So that's a brief overview of what we expect, and I'll explain now how you're going to work in your teams to achieve these goals. So as I've mentioned, there are 4 teams. Each team has a separate section of the document that they're responsible for drafting. And as you work in your team, you will be assigned mentors from the staff and students at Galway who are going to assist that work. When you arrive in your breakout group, your mentors will help you to discuss how you're going to approach that section of the draft within your team. So by the end of today's meeting, you should have decided who within the team is going to take the lead on drafting certain subsections or parts or aspects of what you're responsible for in your own section. You will be given a link to a Google document, and the Google document will be what you use to draft the part of your section. Now, if anyone has any access issues with Google Docs, please let your mentor know, and we will try to make sure that an alternative format is made available for anyone who can't use Google Docs. So for the first week that we're working on this, between now and next Friday, only the members of that team will be able to see what they're writing in that section. Of course, we would encourage you to share as much as possible. This is not a competition. You're not in competition with each other. Unlike the moot court where people were on opposing teams, all of the teams need to collaborate and share. And we've planned that that will happen at various stages throughout the month of summer school. But just for now, to help the team to write their own draft first without too many interferences from outside forces, we're going to give 1 full week for the teams to develop their own draft. And so only the members of your team will have access to the Google Doc for your section, but you'll have full access, so you'll be able to comment on it, you'll be able to edit it, so delete things, insert other things. But we really ask that you do this in collaboration with your team members. So you should really be talking to people in your team about who's writing what section of your draft. And if you have ideas for how that language should be changed or what we're missing and should be added, we ask you to do that initially as comments to whoever is responsible for that subsection. And then, to write your own suggested language as well. What I'm saying is, try to be slow to delete what other people are doing, at least in the first week, to give everyone a chance to have their say on the document. By next Friday, we will be making the various Google Docs that you have drafted available to every participant in the summer school. So at the end of week 2 of summer school, everyone is going to be able to view each other's work. And so you will have access to the Google Docs links for all the other sections. But if you're not in the team that drafted that section, you will only have the power to insert comments. You won't actually have the power to edit that Google Doc that another team has created. But we encourage you, and we have set up meetings for you to discuss your feedback for other groups as well as a team. So we would really encourage you to give constructive feedback to each other. It really does help us to understand what we've missed if people present it as constructive feedback. And even if we disagree with something that somebody has put in their section, be respectful when you point out why your reasons are for thinking that that is maybe not the best way to explain how the right should be applied in practice. So this is our first meeting today where we'll get started. Next week, you'll have a meeting on Thursday at 2 p.m. Irish time, where you'll be finalising your first draft of your section as a team. And then on Friday, the 11th, we'll make all the team drafts available to everyone. And you have a meeting in week 3 on the Thursday, again at 2 p.m. to discuss your feedback that you are giving to the other groups. And that will be visible to all the groups at the end of week 3. And so week 4 is your time to reflect on the comments that you have received for your section, and in your team to decide which comments you're going to take on board, what changes you're going to make, and what changes you're not going to make, because that can be important too. So at the end of week 4, you'll have one final meeting on Thursday of week 4 at 2 p.m. Irish time within your teams to finalise your draft. And then we will be turning over all the draft sections to Rosemary Caius, the chair of the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the real committee. And we will be asking her to give us some feedback on how we've completed this task. So what would the real committee have done differently? What else could we be thinking about? And maybe how could the real committee take on board some of the ideas that we've presented as it continues to hold dialogues with states about Article 30 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So what I'd like to invite you to do now, before we enter the breakout groups, is to press the raise hand button if you have any questions, because I think it's really important. If you have a question, somebody else may be thinking of the same question, and it's better that we answered these up front now in the main room with everyone together before we split up. Even though all of the mentors have the same instructions, it's just in case there's any questions that people have about this task that we can help you to understand better how to complete it before we actually move into our breakout groups to do that work. Don't see any hands raised yet. So maybe everything is clear. Oh, there's one raised hand. Great. Okay, I can't see who it is, but whoever it is, can you turn on your microphone?
Hi, this is Candace.
Hi, Candace.
And thank you. So where do we find or maybe this is going to be in the breakout room. Where do we find the resources of past comments and all of the documents of things that you mentioned just now? Where would we find those, please?
Yeah, you will have more of that in your groups, but I've just put a link to the general comments that have been developed by the UN committee in the chat box. So hopefully that's visible to everyone. If not, you will have it again in your breakout groups. But the main source of information for you will be the committee's website, the UN committee's website, where you should be able to access all of their documents. You may decide to look at other committees as well, as I mentioned, but really it would be sufficient to stick with, for most things, to stick with the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I'm just linking their general webpage in there into the chat as well. Okay, thanks for that, Candace. That's a good clarifying question. Any other questions before we go into our breakout groups? the schedules are in the email, or are there changes? Yeah, so the schedule is the same as what you have received. I see Chrissy has put a question in the chat about the dates that I've mentioned. So as part of the program booklet for summer school, all of these dates are the same as what is in that document. And we've also created a separate document which just explains the participation task. It's been linked in the Discord, and it's also been linked on the DSS Drive on the registration website for summer school. So hopefully everyone has access to that. And yeah, we're not making any changes from those dates. Okay, great. Any final questions? Are we ready to go in our groups for the first time? Okay, don't see any other hands raised or questions in the chat. So I think we are ready to start the breakout groups now.